Forager is a relatively new indie title that's been described as an idle game that you want to actively keep playing. It's like the love child of Stardew Valley, Terraria, and Zelda. You spend your time exploring, crafting, and managing the resources around you. From the moment you drop in, you're given a very brief tutorial, and the rest is really up to you. This game attempts to do just one thing, and that's to make progression addicting and rewarding. The RPG elements, perk system, and open world aspect all culminate to a very satisfying experience. After you've dropped into the world of Forager, you'll begin by constructing a furnace, and from there, your adventure can go any direction you want. Literally. You build or rather purchase as you go. As you acquire resources, you convert some of them into gold for the purpose of purchasing surrounding islands to expand your world. Farming for gold is great and all, but it can get stale after spending several hours doing so. Thankfully, Forager offers two other ways to earn gold, those being trading and combat. Trading is a simple but time-saving mechanic, and how it allows you to convert resources you have an abundance of, and therefore no use for them, to straight gold via a market system. And for those who want a more adventurous way to earn gold, you can focus on combat and side quests. There are various NPCs located around the world that distribute these side quests. Completing their request will result in gold, materials, or sometimes very powerful items. You could also focus more on dungeon crawling, as they are filled with secrets to discover, waves of enemies to fight, and boss battles. With every level you earn, you're rewarded with a point that's redeemable on what I've come to know as the skill tree. The skill tree is a perk system consisting of 4 different categories, with each category comprising the key components of your adventure. The game doesn't limit you to using only one category, but rather encourages you to be diverse in your choosing of skills to learn, until you've learned them all. Although, if you don't want to spend a lot of time mining for gold, I seriously recommend you invest in the economy category. Acquire the coinage skill, and then unlock the market skill. It only takes 3 levels to do this, but it will save you a ton of grinding in the long run. There's a few other ways to earn gold at a faster than normal rate, but I think I've helped enough, and I'll leave you to figure out the rest. Forager consists of 10 basic enemies that you'll come across a lot in your playthrough. There's also 3 bosses to face in the dungeons I mentioned before. The game manages to keep combat interesting by allowing you to swap through different weapons depending on what you need at that moment in time. You need a ranged weapon? Pull out that bow. Want to get in that skeleton's face? Get your sword. Not to mention there's different variants to the types of weapons you have available. Early on you'll be using something like a bone sword, which deals an extra 50% in damage to enemies, and while that may sound like a lot, just wait until you get some of the more powerful weapons and start dealing seriously higher percentages. I'm looking at you, Demon Sword. Now that I've given you a decent summary of the game overall, let's take a moment to look at all the pros the game has to offer. Forager features a very simple pixel art style, but makes up for its simplicity by having a sort of cute charm that's very reminiscent of games like Battle Block Theater or Pit People. The large variety of weapons, items, consumables, craftables, and other materials help to keep the game interesting by always having something new to show or teach you. I have to give credit to how Forager provides the player with a variety of different gameplay situations through the addition of dungeons to explore, lands to traverse, puzzles to solve, and new types of crafting to discover. Offering players the option of going on side quests is a very important part of this game, as it offers missions that aren't part of the core gameplay, but still reward you for taking the time to complete them. Also, since these side missions are optional, players who would rather focus on the main adventure don't have to waste time on doing tasks for NPCs they couldn't care any less about. It would be a crime for me to not take a moment to once again give credit to the skill tree. This feature is really what makes the game for me and adds some much needed depth to what would otherwise be a very boring and repetitive game. The option to grow your character in whichever skill you choose makes Forager a very enjoyable clicker game. The last thing I wanted to mention is that this game is very easy to run on low-end PCs, so don't let not having a monster gaming computer stop you from picking up Forager. I've spent so much time talking about how much I've enjoyed this game that you might have been inclined to think that there were no downsides to it. I'm very sorry to tell you that this isn't the case. The combat, while fluid and satisfying, falls short of being challenging, and I make that statement as someone who's not the best when it comes to video games. I haven't been able to beat Hollow Knight, and while I did beat Celeste, it took a lot of deaths and resets to actually complete it. Not only do the normal enemies fall short of providing a challenge, but the bosses really do as well. Forager doesn't set a heavy focus on slaying monsters and dungeon bosses, which is a shame since it misses out on those feelings of anxiety that come with being so close to finishing off a challenging boss fight. On top of the combat being overly easy, there's not enough obligation to take the game seriously since there's very little punishment for dying. If you die, you get kicked back to the main screen and just load your game back up and you're pretty much right where you left off. If you died in a dungeon, you do get kicked back to the start, but but that's not too much of a punishment since you don't lose your inventory or suffer any other repercussions. There's also no consequence for dying multiple times since you have an infinite number of lives. Since there's no way to lose the game, all feelings of tension are lost. Also, as you near the end of the game, you spend an awful amount of time waiting on certain in-game specific items to craft, which can make acquiring them relatively boring. It was really disappointing to see a game handle its pacing so well and just kind of flop at the very end. Rather than finishing on a high note with a feeling of pride in completing the game, it feels more like I completed a chore that I never wanted to do in the first place. It's a shame that the game handled its pacing so well for 9 hours, only to have the last hour just kind of fizzle out and die. Don't get me wrong, this game was a lot of fun. It just wouldn't be fair of me to not nitpick on the few things that bothered me. Combat was not near as challenging as I would have liked for it to be, and the endgame fumbled with how it handled its pacing. But other than that, there was a lot to love about this game. It accomplishes its goal of being a highly addictive clicker-type adventure game with flying colors. The gameplay formula is very well thought out and executed. The progression mechanics are consistent and completely unique to the individual's playstyle through smart implementation of the skill tree. But most importantly, I found a druid with a treehouse where I was able to put on a top hat. I have to give Forager a strong 3 out of 5.